For 12 years, a monster terrorized California. He would break into homes in the middle of the night, wake victims with a flashlight in their face, whisper through clenched teeth, "Don't move or I'll kill you." He'd stack dishes on the backs of husbands and boyfriends. "If you move, I'll hear them fall. And I'll kill her." Over 50 women raped, 13 people murdered, 120 homes invaded, and here's the part that made it worse: he was a police officer. He used his badge, his training, his knowledge of forensics, to commit crimes and disappear. And then in 1986, he just stopped. Vanished. For 32 years, detectives retired without solving it. Victims grew old waiting for justice. Some died never knowing his name. But he left something behind. At every crime scene. DNA. In 2018, that DNA was uploaded to a genealogy website. The kind you use to find your grandparents. 4 months later, they had him, Joseph James DeAngelo. Age 72. Former cop. Suburban grandfather. Living 3 miles from where some of his attacks occurred. When they arrested him, you know what he said? "I have a roast in the oven." That was it. A roast in the oven, 32 years of silence. And his first words were about dinner. Welcome to Case Unknown, where we investigate the crimes that changed nations, the cases that exposed hidden evils, and the stories that demand to be told. I'm your guide through the darkest chapters of true crime. Last episode, we saw how technology exposed a digital exploitation network in South Korea. Today, we see how technology caught a serial killer who thought 32 years of silence meant he'd gotten away with it. This is the Golden State Killer case. And it's not just a story about murder, it's a story about a cop who became a monster. A justice system that failed victims. And a controversial DNA technique that solved the case, but opened a Pandora's box of privacy questions. Before we continue, this episode discusses sexual assault, murder, and contains details about violent crimes. While we focus on the investigation and won't be gratuitous, the subject matter is disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Resources for victims are in the description. June 18, 1976. 3 a.m. Rancho Cordova, California. A suburb of Sacramento, a woman wakes to a flashlight beam sweeping across her bedroom. Before she can scream, a gloved hand covers her mouth. A voice hisses in her ear. High-pitched. Strained. Like he's speaking through clenched teeth. "Shut up or I'll kill you." A man in a ski mask. Holes cut for eyes and mouth. He's holding a knife, for the next several hours. He terrorizes this woman in her own home. But here's what made investigators realize this wasn't a typical break-in. He knew the house. He moved through it in complete darkness without stumbling. He knew where the phone was. He'd already cut the line. He knew she lived alone. Before he left, he ransacked the house. But he didn't take the obvious valuables. Not the TV. Not the expensive jewelry on the dresser. He took small things. A single earring. A photograph. A class ring. Trophies. Souvenirs. Items that meant something personal, and he left behind something that would haunt investigators for decades: shoelaces. Cut into precise lengths. Ligatures he'd used to bind her. The knots were unusual. Specific. A pattern investigators would see again and again. This wasn't his first attack. It wouldn't be his last. Over the next 3 years, this pattern repeated more than 50 times across Sacramento and surrounding areas. But what made this criminal different, what made him absolutely terrifying, was his preparation. Weeks before an attack, neighbors would report a prowler in their yards. Not running away. Just standing. Watching. Studying. Phone calls would start. Someone on the line breathing. Not speaking. Just breathing. Then hanging up. He was conducting surveillance. Learning routines. Studying floor plans. Finding vulnerabilities, He would break into homes when victims were at work. Unlock windows. Loosen latches. Leave doors slightly ajar, creating entry points for later. Sometimes he'd rearrange small items. Move a vase. Shift a picture frame. Psychological warfare before the attack even happened. When he finally struck, he knew everything. Work schedules. Whether they had roommates. If they owned a dog. The exact layout of every room in the dark, and his signature became unmistakable. If there was a man in the house, a husband, a boyfriend, a roommate, he had a specific ritual. He'd tie them up. Then he'd stack dishes or a teapot on their back. "If you move, I'll hear the dishes. And I'll kill her," he'd whisper. "Do you understand?" Nod if you understand. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical violence, but here's what made it even more sinister. Victims would report hearing him crying between attacks, sobbing, muttering to himself, "I hate you, Bonnie. I hate you." Who was Bonnie? A girlfriend? A mother? No one knew. But the crying created an eerie impression. Like he was two people. The methodical predator. And something broken and pathetic underneath. After attacks, he'd call victims. Sometimes the next day. Sometimes months later. Sometimes years later, heavy breathing on the line. Then that high-pitched voice, "Remember when we played?" Some victims received calls for over a decade after their attacks. By 1979, Sacramento was paralyzed. Women were buying guns, installing alarm systems. Community watch groups patrolled every night. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts. The press called him the East Area Rapist, and the police. They were baffled. They had DNA. They had fingerprints. They had detailed victim descriptions. But no matches. No suspects. Nothing. Some detectives began to suspect something disturbing. This person understood police procedure too well. He knew how to avoid leaving clear fingerprints. He knew to watch for patrol patterns. He knew exactly how crime scenes would be processed. A few detectives wondered, could he be law enforcement? But that theory seemed impossible. A cop wouldn't do this. Right? And then, in October 1979, everything changed. A couple was found murdered in their home in Goleta, near Santa Barbara, 200 miles south of Sacramento. Dr. Robert Offerman and Alexandria Manning. Bludgeoned to death. Tied with ligatures. Shoelaces. The method was different. Murder instead of rape. But something about the scene felt familiar. Over the next 7 years, he would strike in Southern California. Couples. In their homes. Always at night. Always with that same methodical preparation. He'd murder 13 people. Bludgeon them. Shoot them. Strangle them. And then ransack their homes, taking odd items. Personal items. The press called this killer the original Night Stalker. For decades, investigators didn't realize they were hunting the same man. The crimes were 200 miles apart. Different MO, different victims. It wasn't until 2001. 15 years after the last known attack, that DNA finally connected them, the East Area Rapist. The original Night Stalker. The same person. The crime spanned 10 counties. 50 rapes. 13 murders. 120 burglaries. One of the most prolific serial criminals in American history, and then in 1986. He stopped, just stopped. No more attacks. No more calls. No more prowlers. Silence. For investigators, the silence was maddening. Serial offenders don't just stop. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit is clear on this. They escalate. They make mistakes. They get caught. They die, but they don't simply vanish into suburban normalcy. Yet that's exactly what happened. 1986. Nothing. 1990. Nothing, 2000. Nothing, the case went cold. Detectives retired. Files gathered dust in evidence rooms. Victims grew older, some passed away, never knowing who had destroyed their lives, but one detective couldn't let it go, Paul Holes. A cold case investigator with the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, in 1994, as a young investigator just starting his career. Holes was assigned to review the original Night Stalker files. He was supposed to spend a few weeks on it. Write a summary. Move on. He spent 24 years on it, nights. Weekends. Vacations. His wife would joke that the case was his mistress. His colleagues thought he was obsessed. And they were right. He reviewed evidence. Re-interviewed witnesses. Drove to crime scenes, sometimes late at night, trying to see them through the killer's eyes. Chased down hundreds of dead-end leads, and he kept coming back to the DNA. DNA evidence had been collected at multiple crime scenes. Blood on a fence where he'd cut himself. Saliva on ligatures. Other biological material. In the 1970s and 80s, DNA analysis barely existed. They could determine blood type. That was it, but by the 1990s, DNA technology had revolutionized forensics. Those old samples could now generate full genetic profiles. Holes ran the DNA through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, the national criminal DNA database that contains profiles for millions of convicted offenders. No match. Whoever this killer was, he'd never been arrested for a crime requiring DNA collection. Or if he had been arrested, it was before mandatory DNA laws existed. Paul Holes ran that DNA over and over throughout the years. Every time CODIS added new profiles, every few months, he'd submit the Golden State Killer DNA again. Nothing. 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 The killer had seemingly vanished without a trace. Living among us. Maybe still in California. Maybe he'd moved. Maybe he'd died. No one knew, but there was someone else who became obsessed, Michelle McNamara. A true crime writer. Not law enforcement. Just someone who couldn't let the case go. She spent years researching. Interviewing victims. Reviewing police files. Connecting dots that others had missed. She was writing a book about the investigation. She was the one who coined the name that stuck, the Golden State Killer. One name for all the crimes. One monster. One hunt. In 2016, Michelle McNamara died suddenly in her sleep. She was 46 years old. Undiagnosed heart condition. She never finished her book. She never saw the killer caught, but her work had done something important. It reignited public interest. Her husband, comedian Patton Oswalt, finished her book with help from researchers. I'll Be Gone in the Dark was published in February 2018. It became a massive bestseller. Suddenly, millions of people were reading about the Golden State Killer. The case was back in the national spotlight. Tips flooded in. Cold case units got funding, and Paul Holes, who was planning to retire in March 2018 after a long career, decided to try one more thing, something that had never been used to catch a serial killer, something controversial. Something that would change criminal investigations forever, and something that would spark a massive debate about privacy, DNA, and how far law enforcement should be allowed to go, genealogy DNA. In late 2017, Paul Holes and FBI investigators had a radical idea. Genealogy websites had exploded in popularity. Ancestry.com, 23andMe. Millions of people uploading their DNA to find relatives. Trace their heritage. Discover if they're 2% Viking or related to royalty. What if they uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA to one of those sites, not to find him directly? That was impossible. His DNA wasn't in any database, but to find his relatives. Third cousins. Fourth cousins. People who shared a great-great-great-grandparent with him, then they could build family trees. Trace lineages. Narrow down possibilities. Find which branch of the tree led to the killer. It was brilliant. It was revolutionary, and it was legally murky. Most genealogy sites have strict policies. No law enforcement. No uploading DNA without consent. Privacy is paramount. You can't get a warrant for someone you can't identify. Catch 22, but there was one site that was different. GeneMatch. GeneMatch is a free, open-source genealogy database. Users upload raw DNA data from other testing services to find relatives. It's public. Unregulated. Anyone can upload. Anyone can search. It was perfect. And perfectly controversial. In April 2018, investigators created a fake profile. Uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA. And waited. The system found matches, not close relatives. Distant ones. Third cousins. Fourth cousins. People who shared ancestors from the 1800s with the killer. Now came the detective work. The genealogy, Barbara Ray Venter. An investigative genetic genealogist. An expert at building family trees from DNA fragments, she took those matches and started tracing backward. Birth certificates. Marriage licenses. Census records. Obituaries. Church records. Everything. She was looking for the common ancestors. The point where all these family trees intersected. Then she built forward. Generation by generation. Who were the descendants? Where did they live in the 1970s and 80s? What were their ages, days of work? Then weeks. Hundreds of possibilities. Then dozens. Then a handful, and one name kept appearing, Joseph James DeAngelo, born November 8, 1945. Would have been 30 years old in 1976 when the East Area rapist attack started. 41 in 1986 when they stopped, lived in Sacramento. Citrus Heights. Exactly where many attacks occurred, and here's the detail that made investigators' blood run cold. Joseph DeAngelo was a cop, Exeter Police Department, 1973 to 1976. Then Auburn Police Department, 1976 to 1979, he was fired in 1979. Caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a drugstore. Fired from the force. His career over. The same year the East Area rapist attacks in Northern California stopped, suddenly, everything made sense, the police procedure knowledge. The forensic awareness. The ability to avoid detection. The understanding of patrol patterns. He wasn't just a criminal. He was law enforcement. He'd been investigating crimes by day. Committing them by night, but investigators needed proof. DNA from GeneMatch wasn't enough. They needed his DNA. Direct comparison, so they followed him, April 2018. Surveillance teams watched Joseph DeAngelo's modest home in Citrus Heights. A suburb of Sacramento. He was 72 years old. Retired. Living with a daughter and granddaughter. He looked like someone's grandfather. Frail. Balding. Ordinary. They watched him take out trash. Go to grocery stores. Run errands. They were waiting for him to discard something. Anything with his DNA, April 23, 2018. DeAngelo drives to a Hobby Lobby, surveillance teams follow at a distance. He goes inside. Browses. Buys something. Returns to his car. He sits in the parking lot for a moment. Does something in his car. Then drives away. The moment his car leaves the parking lot, investigators swarm the area. They search where he parked. And they find it. He discarded something. A tissue? A cup? The exact item has never been publicly disclosed. But it had his DNA on it. The DNA was rushed to a lab. Compared to Golden State Killer crime scene samples from the 1970s and 80s, it was a perfect match, 13 markers. Then 20. Then full profile, it was him, April 24, 2018. 6 a.m., Joseph James DeAngelo, age 72, was in his backyard in Citrus Heights. Wearing a robe. Pottering around. Maybe checking his roses. Maybe taking out trash. It was a quiet Tuesday morning. Neighbors leaving for work. Birds singing. Sprinklers running. Suddenly, police vehicles converged from every direction. Unmarked cars. SWAT vans. FBI. Sacramento County Sheriff. Dozens of officers. Joseph DeAngelo. Come out with your hands up. Now, DeAngelo shuffled out of his house. Confused. Blinking in the morning light. He looked pathetic. A frail old man in a bathrobe. Officers surrounded him. Guns drawn. Hands up. On your knees, he complied. No resistance. No dramatic standoff, and then he spoke, I have a roast in the oven. That was all he said. In that moment. After 32 years of silence. After terrorizing hundreds of people. After destroying countless lives, I have a roast in the oven. News helicopters captured everything. An elderly man in handcuffs shuffled to a police car. Neighbors came outside, shocked. That quiet man. Joe. The grandfather who lived down the street. By noon, the news was everywhere. The Golden State Killer had been caught. Paul Holes watched from home. He'd retired just 2 months earlier. He'd dedicated 24 years to this case. And he wasn't even there for the arrest, but he felt relief. Vindication. And something else. Sadness. That it had taken this long. Victims were notified. Some sobbed. Others felt nothing. Too much time had passed. Too much damage. Sharon Huddle, DeAngelo's ex-wife, was stunned. They'd been married from 1973 to 1991. 18 years. She said she had no idea. Some investigators believe her. Others don't. How do you not know your husband is committing 50 rapes and a dozen murders? His daughters. His granddaughters. Neighbors. Friends. All shocked. He was quiet. Kept to himself. A little odd. But not this. At Sacramento County Jail, DeAngelo was processed. His DNA officially collected. It matched. His fingerprints matched prints from crime scenes in the 1970s. During searches of his home, investigators found trophies. Jewelry. Photos. Items stolen from victims decades ago. Hidden in his garage, he was charged with 13 counts of first-degree murder. Multiple kidnapping counts. Prosecutors prepared for trial, but there was a problem. DeAngelo was 72. His lawyers claimed he was suffering from dementia. Heart issues. Cancer. A trial could take years. He might die before a verdict, and here's the more painful reality. Most of his crimes, the 50 rapes, the 120 burglaries. Statutes of limitations had expired. He could only be charged with murders. In June 2020, prosecutors offered a deal. Plead guilty to 13 murders. Admit to dozens of uncharged rapes and burglaries. In exchange, avoid the death penalty. Life without parole instead. DeAngelo took it. Some victims were outraged. He deserved death. Others were relieved. At least there would be closure. No lengthy trial. No appeals for decades. August 2020. Sacramento County Superior Court. The sentencing hearing lasted 4 days. Dozens of victims and family members gave impact statements. Some were now in their 70s and 80s. They'd waited over 40 years for this moment. One woman, now 71, described how she slept with a knife under her pillow for 40 years. Every night. Still, another described the phone calls. How he'd call her every year on the anniversary of her attack. For a decade. Until she changed her number. Again. And again, family members of murder victims spoke. One woman's mother was killed in 1977. The daughter was 7 years old. She's now in her 50s. She described growing up without a mother. The hole that never healed. Joseph DeAngelo sat in a wheelchair. Showing no emotion, some victims noticed he looked frail. Weak. But when deputies moved him, his legs worked fine. When he thought no one was watching, he sat up straight. Was he faking? Playing up his age and illness? Many believe he was. When it was his turn to speak, he gave a brief statement. I've listened to all your statements. Each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt. His voice cracked. He appeared to cry, but his statement was generic. No details. No explanation. No real acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just, sorry. One victim shouted, "You're not sorry. You're sorry you got caught." The judge sentenced him to 11 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Plus 15 additional life sentences to run concurrently. Plus 8 years for enhancements. Joseph James DeAngelo will die in prison. He's currently incarcerated at California State Prison, Corcoran. Protective custody. Away from general population. He's 79 years old now, but the Golden State Killer case did more than catch one man. It changed everything about criminal investigations. The technique used to catch him, genetic genealogy, has now solved over 150 cold cases. Murders from the 70s, 80s, 90s. Cases that seemed impossible, but it also ignited a massive controversy. Privacy advocates argue this is a violation of genetic privacy. When you upload your DNA to find relatives, should police be able to access it? What about your cousins who never uploaded DNA but can now be identified through you? Match changed its terms of service. Users must now opt in to allow law enforcement searches. Most don't. Major genealogy sites like Ancestry and 23andMe prohibit law enforcement access entirely, but the precedent is set. Your DNA isn't just yours. It's a map to your entire family. And that map can now be used to find criminals. Is that justice? Or invasion? The debate continues. For victims of the Golden State Killer, the answer is simple. They got justice. Delayed. But not denied. For Joseph DeAngelo, the answer is prison. Forever. For the rest of us, the question remains, how much privacy are we willing to sacrifice for safety? Joseph James DeAngelo thought he'd gotten away with it. 32 years of silence. Retirement. Grandchildren. A quiet life in the suburbs. He thought his police training would protect him. His careful planning. His understanding of forensics. What he didn't count on was science advancing beyond his comprehension. He left DNA at crime scenes when DNA analysis barely existed. He couldn't have imagined that 40 years later, that DNA would be uploaded to a genealogy website, that distant cousins he'd never met would unknowingly provide the genetic trail leading directly to him. Paul Holes, the detective who worked this case for 24 years, said something haunting after the arrest. We didn't catch him because he made a mistake. We caught him because technology caught up to the evidence he left behind decades ago. That's the new reality. Nothing is erased. Nothing is forgotten. Evidence waits. Technology evolves, and for criminals who think they got away with it, the past is always waiting. The Golden State Killer is behind bars. But there are thousands of cold cases still waiting to be solved with the same technology. This is Case Unknown, where we investigate not just crimes, but how justice finds a way, even decades later. And the controversies that come with it. If this investigation resonated with you, if you believe these stories need to be told, subscribe. Your support helps us uncover more cases that demand justice. If you or someone you know has experienced sexual assault, resources are in the description. Next episode on Case Unknown, we're going digital again. The Silk Road. A billion-dollar dark web drug empire. And the libertarian who built it, until the FBI came knocking. But here's the question we'll explore. Was Ross Ulbricht a criminal mastermind, or a scapegoat? His supporters want him pardoned. His victims want him forgotten. And the truth, is complicated. Until then, remember, the unknown is only unknown. Until someone asks the right questions. Thank you for listening. This is Case Unknown.